The waves lapping against the hull sounded steady, yet they could not drown out the mocking laughter from the shore.
This rowing class looks like a comedy act in a war museum. Who lets kids learn from an old lady? A parent sneered, prompting others to laugh uproariously. On the weathered boat named Steady Tide, a silver-haired woman with a perfectly straight posture was teaching the children how to hold their oars. Her hands trembled slightly. Her gaze, however, was as unwavering as the sea at dawn. Helen Carter, 81 years old, offered no reply. She simply raised her hand to signal the children to turn the boat. But one morning, the derision reached its peak when the Coast Guard arrived and ordered the class to stop for safety reasons. Helen did not argue. She only clutched her thick logbook and stood at the boat's side like a gatekeeper of memories. Less than an hour later, the sea suddenly stirred, only to reveal a U.S. Navy cruiser entering the bay. It was led by a man whose life Helen had once saved. What could compel the military to intervene for an old woman teaching rowing? And what past is waiting to be uncovered? Subscribe to Veteran Best Stories to hear the full, astonishing tale. The small Maine port town still woke each morning to the hush of waves and the salt-tinged air weaving through weathered wooden houses. Everything bore the breath of the sea, every shutter, every corrugated roof, even the white fence bleached by fog and wind. At a quiet corner of the dock, where few ventured, the boat's Steady Tide lay moored, silent as a witness to countless tides. Its hull peeled of paint, its mooring line frayed, yet it remained steadfast, as though determined not to yield to time. Beside it stood a silver-haired woman, slight of frame, hands calloused. Helen Carter, the soul of that place. For more than 20 years, Helen had spent every summer teaching poor children to row, to read the wind, to tie a cleat, and to trust their own hands in the vast ocean. No tuition, no nameplates, no organizational insignia. She taught not from books, but from experience. Each scratch on her hands, each stormy day when she stayed at the dock to guide a child with nowhere else to go. She required only one promise, that they would one day teach another, not merely the skill, but the courage and faith. Not everyone understood. Society changed, and people grew pragmatic. Parents began to whisper. They could not fathom why an elderly woman would lead children into wind and waves without contract or certification. Some called her a self-appointed hero. One man blurted out at a council meeting, "She's endangering those kids and thinks it's noble." Helen heard it all, but she did not respond. She knew that anything of value must first face suspicion before earning respect. The most enduring things often must overcome initial misunderstanding. Until one morning, while dawn's light had not yet pierced the coastal mist, she heard heavy footsteps on the wooden planks. The Coast Guard had arrived. They carried forms and pitying eyes. They said there was a complaint, that her teaching lacked safety certification, and that, by regulation, Helen must cease until all legal procedures were completed. No debate, no emotion, just an administrative command, colder than winter seawater. Helen did not protest, yet she could not hide the storm rising in her heart. Her eyes, accustomed to reading winds and predicting rain, blurred for a moment. She stood, gazing at the rippling sea. Dawn's light danced on each wave as if warning her that all she had safeguarded could sink, not because of weather, but because of people. A strong gust caught her old coat, whipping it like a battered sail that refused to collapse. Her back curved slightly, not from age, but from the weight of accumulated fatigue. The children arrived late that day and found her sitting silently on the boat. No oar in hand, no lines to tie, just sitting as if listening to her own voice amid wind and salt. When they asked why, she only said softly, "Today, we do not row." But within Helen, the sea was far from calm. A sense of helplessness, one she had not known in 20 years, returned. Not because of a cancelled lesson, but because something far greater was at stake. A system that could dim the spirit of service simply because it lacked an official seal. An ideal could be deemed dangerous merely because it lay outside a prescribed license. Helen knew she did not live to challenge anyone. She only wished to pass on what the sea had taught her, that a person is truly free only when they know how to steer themselves, even when no one recognizes it. And the most painful blow was not the citation, nor the temporary suspension, but the children's faces that day, disappointed, confused, and silent. They were not yet old enough to understand why, but they were sensitive enough to know they had lost something precious. Helen sat on the old boat. Her hand rested on a splintered gunwale. The sea wind brushed her face. In that silence, she did not think of laws, nor of judgment. She thought of her initial promise. If there was even one child who still yearned to learn, she would be there. But now, even that seemed threatened. She closed her eyes, and amid the salty scent and the soft rustle of a small flag fluttering at the bow, Helen understood. Some waves cannot be rowed against, but some values, once anchored deep in the heart, can weather any storm, just as steady tide remained moored through countless tempests. The narrow cabin smelled of damp wood, mingled with the salty tang of the sea seeping into every plank. Helen sat there, in that place she had called home for so many years, facing a simple wooden chest, where she kept a nearly 100-page logbook. That book was more than paper and ink. It was a part of her life, recorded in crooked handwriting, smudged by rainwater, tremulous from cold winds. Within its pages were every little lesson, every time she had sailed into high waves, every unexpected rescue, and every rule written not to impose, but to save the lives of children who knew nothing of the sea. Those pages recorded summers without pay, mornings teaching children how to tie knots, how to read clouds to predict wind, how to keep their grip steady when the waves began to rise. The children, that day, huddled on the dock approach in unusual silence. They understood little, only that the boat would not leave the pier today. To them, that was stranger than being taught to row the wrong way. Their eyes fixed on her, some bewildered, some anxious, some biting back tears as if sensing something was coming to an end. Helen said nothing. She sat down, slowly opened the chest's lid, and took out the logbook, running her hand along its spine in a deliberate motion. That gesture was not habit. It was a personal ritual, a way for her to reconnect with something that was slipping away. Her aged fingers trembled over each fold, then paused mid-page. The wind turned a few pages, revealing tilted lines. 15.79966, Force 10 Storm, Team 3, Emergency Order, Move to Rescue Boat 42, 14 people, none lost. And at that moment, memories thought to have grown faded sprang to life like surging waves. In 1966, when she had been a Navy rescue team trainer at age 30, a Force 10 storm had struck the bay. Word came of a crew stranded on a rocky outcrop far from shore. No one wanted to sail out, except Helen and her small team. 5 lifeboats cut through the waves as if slicing through steel. She did not recall every word spoken, but remembered the sea's salt stinging her skin, the wind howling in her ears, and her hand gripping the mooring line as if her life hung by that wrist. When they returned, everyone presumed they had perished. Yet they came back, every single one, soaked, battered, exhausted, but with no one left behind. Among that team was a young man named Raymond. He had broken a leg against the hull and lost consciousness in her arms when a huge wave struck the boat. After that day, Raymond never went to sea again. He lived inland, avoiding anything related to water. Helen held no blame. Some fears demand companionship, not conquest. But 3 months ago, she received a letter. It was from Raymond, not the shy boy of before, but now a senior commander in the Navy, in charge of a brand new cruiser. The letter was short, only a few lines. I have never forgotten. We survived because of you. Whenever you need me, just call. She read it, then folded it away without replying. She had never thought she would need anyone. Yet now, sitting here, in the old vessel's cabin, with children watching her every move, and the Coast Guard's edict still weighing on her mind, she realized some things cannot be fought alone forever. She placed her hand on the page where the rescue team's oath was written so long ago. We will not leave anyone behind. We will not depart the sea as long as life remains out there. Though she was no longer in uniform, and no one now commanded her to act, Helen still lived by that principle. And now, that principle, like a small flame in the night, was all she had left to hold on to. Outside the cabin, clouds began to gather. The children had not left. They needed no explanation. They only needed to know she remained. And when Helen returned the logbook to its chest, she lifted her gaze and took a deep breath, looking toward the pier as if searching for a signal. The sea lay as it always did, vast and uncertain. Yet within her, something had shifted. No longer was her sorrow receding. Rather, a plan was silently taking shape. For she knew no one can forbid another from passing on courage. And if there were still someone out there who remembered, still survived because of what she had sown, then she was not alone. Even if warning signs sealed the dock's entrance, there were still paths that opened, from gratitude itself, from memories that endured, and from those souls once saved by her hands, on days when the sea seemed determined to swallow all hope. Helen gripped the oar firmly, not to leave the pier today, but to remind herself she was still ready. Because true value requires no certification. It needs only preservation, through memory, through belief, and through action that never falters. A long horn sounded from the horizon, ripping through the stillness that usually settled over the small harbor. The sound was unlike the fishing boat's calls, neither hurried nor loud, but deep, resonant, echoing like a summons from the past. Locals began to pour out of cafes, shops, and doorsteps, converging toward the dock. Curiosity shone in their eyes. And then, through the thin morning mist, the colossal steel hull of a warship slowly emerged, its white paint and gleaming insignia stark against the gray sea. An advanced cruiser slicing straight into the bay. Helen stood where she had stood all these years, motionless, head bowed, her expression as calm as it was inscrutable. Inside her, waves of memory battered her mind like a storm pounding an old vessel's hull. The Coast Guard officers startled and took a step back, still clutching their unfinished reports. Every procedure they thought tightly controlled suddenly felt small before the sight of that ship and what it carried. The bow door swung open. A group of officers appeared, immaculately dressed in crisp white uniforms. Leading them was a tall man, hair turning gray, his face lined with experience, yet still bearing the resolute bearing of a commander. He descended onto the dock with slow, deliberate steps. His hat was removed. He clasped it in his hand. His gaze locked on the elderly woman standing unmoving beside the old boat. When he stopped before her, all sound seemed to fade away. At last, Helen lifted her head. Her eyes blinked once. In that instant, time seemed to stand still. The sea breeze still blew. The small flag at the boat's bow still fluttered. But everything was merely background to this silent reunion between two souls who had once faced life and death together nearly 6 decades ago. No introduction was needed. No opening words. Their eyes met, enough to recall everything. The man's voice rang out, deep and steady, like a drumbeat echoing in the chests of all who witnessed. "Instructor Carter," he said, each word delivered as if part of a solemn ritual. "I am alive because of you." Whispers rippled through the crowd. The Coast Guard straightened involuntarily, falling silent. Local reporters, there out of curiosity, now flipped on their recorders, yet none dared interrupt. The man stepped aside, turned to the other officers, then fixed his gaze on the Coast Guard. His tone was firm, never raised, each word striking like wind against the heart. This boat, this class, these are more genuine training grounds than any academy I have ever attended. Each syllable emphasized not Helen's past deeds, but the value of what she had preserved for so many years, quietly without seeking acclaim. A hush fell, as though the sea itself paused its waves. Then, from behind, a single clap broke the silence, tentative, soft, from a boy in Helen's class. Next came another child, then everyone. Those small hands began to applaud, slowly at first, then in unison. No one prompted them, yet they all understood. Somehow they sensed that this moment was not just for Helen, but for anyone who had ever believed that devotion need not be codified by law. The man, now standing fully in his command stance, took a step forward, drew from his breast pocket an envelope sealed with an official insignia. "I requested authorization from the Department of the Navy," he said, his voice lower, yet his eyes shining as if offering something sacred. "We will fully sponsor your rowing program, the boat, the equipment, and the instructional materials." Helen said nothing. She looked at him, then down at the logbook resting before her. Each slanted line of her handwriting, every wind lesson, now would continue to be written. No longer threatened, no longer forced to conceal. From today forward, what she built would have a broader, sturdier home. Not to shield her, but so those children could continue learning how to face the waves. The crowd, once accustomed to doubt, now slipped into silence. Not from fear, but from emotion. Those who had once criticized now lowered their heads. Some eyes glistened. And in that moment, Helen realized she was no longer alone. The loneliness of standing against injustice had been replaced by support and recognition, not through grand honors, but through the most practical action of all, allowing her to keep doing what was right. Helen placed her hand on the boat's gunwale, feeling the old, faded wood. But today, it was more than an object. It was a witness, a place of beginning, and now a place of continuation. She nodded softly, not in thanks, but in acceptance. She would carry on, no matter how much the world changed, as long as there were waves and children needing to learn to row, she would be here. The sea breeze rose again, but this time it no longer carried suspicion. It carried belief, spreading across the dock, through the wooden awnings, and into the hearts of those watching a lone, elderly woman beside her old boat, someone who had quietly performed the greatest deed of all, giving the next generation the ability to steer themselves. A long, emotional nod followed the Navy's decision to sponsor her. Helen then inclined her head slightly toward the man who had once been a young sailor and spoke in a low voice, almost as if confessing to herself, "I am not doing this for attention. I only want the children to feel the power of self-reliance." Those words were not directed at anyone, nor did they demand a response. They reflected what she had believed for decades, and still believed at this very moment. But Helen understood, after today, what she was doing was no longer just a personal dream. The story of the Navy ship docking solely to honor an elderly woman running an unauthorized rowing class went viral overnight. Videos capturing the commander handing over the sponsorship letter, the children's applause, and Helen standing beside her weathered boat appeared across every news platform, from phones in local pockets to giant screens in boardrooms as far away as California. Headlines popped up in succession. A classroom on the high seas. Woman defies regulation with kindness. Enduring values survive. The next day, television vans lined the waterfront road. Reporters from neighboring states peered from behind cameras, angling for the perfect shot of the woman living a modern legend. Yet Helen, as if unaware of what had just happened, kept her routine unchanged. She rose at 5 each morning, carried her old notebook wrapped in canvas to the dock, checked the mooring lines, and studied the water as if the sea were whispering secrets she had to understand. When invited onto live television to recount her story, Helen declined. She did not like cameras, nor did she feel the need to fix her hair or add a jacket to conceal wrinkles. She only wanted to board her boat, just as every day before, and each morning she still read the first lesson to the children. Grip your oar firmly, keep your heart straight. To her, if they remembered those words, no further explanation was necessary. That event did more than simply allow the rowing class to continue. It triggered something far greater, a quiet yet powerful wave of change in how the adults along that coastline perceived what they had once dismissed as outdated. They, those who had once thought her a backwards old woman, now listened. Gone were complaints and skeptical looks. Instead, in the evenings, parents would sit with their children at dinner and listen as the kids described what they had learned. The children, who had once been enthralled only by screens, began to tell their parents how Helen taught them to listen to the sea's surface, to distinguish between a storm wind and a playful breeze. They described how to hold the oar so they would not veer off course, even when struck by waves. And the parents, sometimes speechless, realized for the first time that their children were learning something beyond a skill. They were learning how to stand firm in a world that never stops moving. No one mentioned social media during those lessons. No one mentioned television. There were only Helen, the children, and the sea. But somewhere in their eyes, and in the gaze of the adults watching from a distance, was change. No fanfare, no slogans, just the quiet transformation of a small community, thanks to one steadfast person who needed no permit, no cameras, only an ideal. The afternoon after that day, when the sun cast long shadows on the dock, Helen sat alone at the boat's bow. The children had all gone home. The waves lapped gently against the wooden hull, creating a familiar rhythm that only someone who had lived by the sea all their life could recognize. She opened her notebook and wrote a new entry. Day 1, after everything. The handwriting remained shaky, but her hand did not tremble as it had yesterday. Beneath that line, she drew a small circle,
a symbol she used each time a lesson succeeded, each time a child surpassed themselves. Helen did not speak, but she knew the greatest thing was not the Navy ship, nor the sponsorship letter. It was that a once disparaged value had been resurrected, passed from hand to hand, received with respect. The trust she had invested in each oar had not sunk. It had docked, exactly where it needed to be, in the hearts of those who believed they had forgotten how to listen. Tomorrow she would teach as before, but in the children's eyes, and in her own heart, something would be different, something indefinable, something felt, like the saltiness of the sea, like a breeze when the water changes color, like faith when it is finally anchored in the right place. One Saturday morning, when thin rays of sunlight stretched across the water, and the small bay lay as still as if holding its breath, the children poured in, chaotic and eyes alight with excitement. Among them, one hid a small wooden box carefully wrapped in an old cloth and tied with a red ribbon, as if it were a treasure. They stood in a line along the dock, none speaking first. But when Helen appeared, her silver hair, familiar rubber boots, and the notebook in her hand, every child spoke together, hesitantly, yet firmly. "You're our captain." She paused, not from surprise, but because her heart tightened as if a wave had slid across her shoulders. The box was placed in her hands, so light it seemed empty, yet her fingers trembled at its rough wooden surface. Helen opened the lid. Inside lay a small badge, cut from an old soda can, warped and crude, but etched in crude letters with blurred ink, carved deep. Coach of the Sea. In that moment she could not speak. She still clutched the box, while her eyes misted, not from bright light, but from an emotion long untouched. Her tears did not stream. They only gathered at the corners of her eyes that had once faced the fiercest winds and the tensest rescues. But this emotion did not come from a storm. It came from the silent gratitude of small hearts looking to her with pure thanks. The children did not fully understand. They knew nothing of the times she had sat alone by the boat, worried that no one would want to learn to hold an oar, afraid that this generation might forget what she had fought to preserve. They'd never seen her cry, never seen her eyes glaze over when criticized or when the Coast Guard ordered her to halt her class. But today, they sensed something. The woman they had once thought strongest was truly moved, and the handmade gift, clumsy as it was, had awakened in her the deepest part of herself, a validation that needed no words. She slowly closed the lid, placed her hand on its coarse top, as if to hold on to the feeling of cold metal warmed by human emotion. Her fingers trembled, but not from weakness. They trembled because they held something containing a fragment of the faith she had sent into the world, and now returned, whole, pure, and more alive than any medal ever awarded on a stage. There was no applause, no cameras, no background music or banners, only the sound of waves lapping against the hull, the cry of seabirds overhead, and the silent presence of gratitude. Helen sat on the bow, the box still in her hands. The children, understanding she needed time, sat beside her, neither crowded nor restless. They simply sat as they had been taught, to listen not with ears, but with hearts. Sunlight filtered across the deck, glinting on the badge, making those crude letters gleam in the golden dawn. Helen closed her eyes and inhaled deeply. She did not think of anything far away. She only felt that what she had sown was no longer a single seed in the sand. It had begun to sprout, and these children, through their innocence and courage not yet hardened by the world, were living proof. Helen placed the box inside her old notebook,
as if it were an indispensable part of her journey. No further notes were needed, because some things need not be written down. They exist in the way one's heart beats faster when knowing they are no longer alone, in the way children's eyes give love without needing instruction. That morning's lesson held no formal lecture. They did not sail out to sea. But it was their greatest lesson, not for the children, but for Helen herself, that what she had preserved was not only recognized, it was inherited, not by promise, but by small acts of genuine sincerity. That afternoon, after the children had gone home, Helen remained alone on the deck. The sea lay calm, the sky clear, the waves gentle. Everything appeared normal. Yet inside her, something had changed forever. Her faith. No longer the solitary faith of one keeper of the flame. Now it was a faith received, preserved by another generation. A generation that knew how to etch letters with a knife, how to sit silently beside someone moved to tears, and how gratitude, if sincere, can bridge every gap of age, era, and regulation. The boat remained moored at the dock as always, but now it was more than just a vessel. It was a symbol. And Helen, she needed nothing more. Each morning, she would only need wind, water, and children seeking her out with eager hearts, curious hands, and a heart large enough to hear what the sea had always whispered. Today, the rowing class aboard the Steady Tide continues on schedule. That old boat, its paint peeling, is no longer merely a vessel adrift on the water, but has become a symbol. Helen, though her back is more bent and her hands less steady, still arrives at the dock each early morning. Her figure may be small against the vast sky, but her gaze remains as resolute as ever. She still grips her oar, still studies the water to sense the wind, still repeats her old lesson: maintain balance, not just in body, but in courage. The children of those early days are no longer small hands struggling in the waves. Some have become sailors, setting sail across oceans. Others are engineers or marine researchers, diving into the world of water with passion. Yet when asked what shaped their paths, they rarely mention classrooms. Instead, they recall a silver-haired woman standing on deck, explaining the wind and the human heart. And they remember the phrase she often repeated, etched into their minds: "The wind does not sink the boat. Only a wavering heart can steer us off course." Helen never sought the limelight. Yet what she left behind has transcended the limits of the dock. In the town's small museum, among old photographs of bygone vessels, hangs a simple framed photo. Helen sitting in the boat, her hand clutching the tin badge the children made. The photo wasn't taken with a professional camera, nor is it perfectly composed. But it hangs there, not for its artistic value, but for the story it represents. A woman who chose not to rest, not to seek titles, but to continue sowing goodness until her final moments. There are people who make us look up, but there are also people who make us want to bow our heads, not because they stand tall, but because their hearts are wider than the sea. Helen is such a person, a life lived without noise or demands. She was simply patient, persistent, like the silent waves that wear down the rocks, like the sun that never fails to rise each morning. And if this story moves you, please share it with your loved ones in the United States. Because there are heroes who need no armor or titles, no cameras or stages. Sometimes they need only an oar and a heart that never stops believing. Click subscribe to Veteran Best Stories so you won't miss stories like this. Stories of steadfast resolve, of quiet values, and the beauty of selfless giving. Because sometimes, gratitude should not be a fleeting thank you, but a way of life, repeated every day. Just as Helen lived, and continues to live, through every wave, every student, and every story retold with profound respect,